a short meditation, then give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit, to come into this space with a bit more calm, less distraction. Then on the basis of that, we'll set our motivation together. So just do a few minutes of meditation on the breath for these first part of the meditation. Most of you, I'm sure, have a way of working with the breath. If you need a suggestion, then I'll advise working with the area around the nostrils where we feel the air coming in and out as we inhale, as we exhale. Just making that very subtle sensation that occurs in this area, your meditation object, and just staying present with it as best as you can, trying not to let the mind wander. But whenever the mind does wander, whatever way we're working with the breath, we want to be vigilant, paying attention. And when that happens, we simply let go of whatever it was that distracted us. No judgment, simply return back to the breath. Then, if after a few minutes in silence meditating on the breath, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for today's class. So I'll ring the bell to begin the period. So now let's take a few minutes to cultivate our motivation very deeply and recall that this motivation of bodhicitta is based on a mind of equanimity, which we see is difficult to practice in our world. We have those beings that we are naturally drawn towards, who we have benefited from, or who think like us, who hold political views like us. And then we have those beings that we have a strong aversion towards, that we might even consider to be our enemies, because they do the opposite. They harm us or those that we love. Their views are very different to ours. Their political beliefs very different from ours. And then we have the vast number of beings who fall into the category of strangers, those who we don't have any particular regard for because they simply haven't come forward as a being that we feel close towards or distant from. And instead we generate an indifference towards all of them. So especially in this day and age, when we have so much division in our world, when we see how easily people fall into partiality, into having biases towards each other, we know how important it is that we have a mind that holds all of these beings with equal regard. And to do that today, let's reflect on that very basic fact that there is absolutely no difference between yourself, your friends, the difficult people, the strangers, every single being, in terms of each of us simply desiring to be happy and wanting to not suffer. And moreover, in spite of that wish, that desire, sentient beings, ourselves included, continue to not find true peace and happiness, continue to have to experience suffering. We are all in the same boat, all in the same fundamental predicament. And then we can hold an additional thought, which I touched on earlier in the prayers, which is that every single being has the potential to know the true causes of happiness, to be free from all the causes of suffering. They have Buddha nature. Their minds are not obscured by the delusions. They're only there on a temporary basis. These obscurations can absolutely be removed by following the Buddhist path. So with all of that as a foundation for regarding all these beings in an equal light, generate the thoughts of love that wants all sentient beings to be free or to have happiness and the causes of happiness, and compassion that wants every single being to be free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. And on the basis of that, recognizing that if we ever want this to become reality, if we ever want all beings to know the true peace that they seek, to never have even a single moment of suffering or dissatisfaction, we absolutely have to become more qualified. We have to work on our own minds. We have to attain the state of Buddhahood. For in that state, we then will be imbued with perfect qualities, perfect compassion and love, but moreover, perfect wisdom that knows exactly how to benefit each and every single sentient being, to lead them on their path to attaining the same goal. So hold that mind of bodhicitta for all sentient beings without exception. And make this your motivation for being here today to engage in this class. Okay, again, it's wonderful to be back with all of you. I was mentioning in the puja last night that I found my organization of my talk today changing as the results came out yesterday in the presidential election, which, we're all very happy about. Most of us, I mean, I'm sure there are people, and we know there are at least some 70 million people who voted, in the opposite way for the other candidate, and certainly are disappointed today. But it really is all still in the same category, as much as I certainly will try to work with that idea too, that we not kind of have an expectation beyond what will really happen in terms of this new presidency and what have you. But this is reality. This is what we have to deal with. And so my hope is that by looking at not just the unpleasant things that we've been dealing with over these last months since I was last with all of you, with COVID expanding, exploding, now the numbers even going higher, with so much racial tension and unrest in this country, with all of the political division going on. I mean, there's so much to work with, so much that we have in our lives. And so my hope is that today we can look at some of these things through a Buddhist lens, through taking the teachings, especially the teachings that our dear precious Lama Zopa Rinpoche gives us in terms of how to transform all of these into a path, and use them as practical advice so that we can actually make the most out of this time. So we obviously see that one of the biggest faults that we have in terms of our lives, that all sentient beings have, is the tendency to put all of their happiness and measure of whether that's sustainable or not on external situations, on needing to fix everything on the outside. Now we all, go back to that wonderful verse from Master Shantideva, where he essentially says, if it's something that can be changed, well, then why get unhappy? Why get, stressed out? Why have anxiety? Why have fear? Because you can change it. It's something that you can actually do something about. And then we have the second part of the verse, which essentially says, but if it's something that can't be changed, well, then all of those emotions, all of that stress and anxiety and fear and trepidation, all of that doesn't really amount to much because it's not something that we can fundamentally change. But of course, the backdrop for all of this is that regardless of what the situation is, whether it can be changed or can't be changed, we have to work with our minds. Working with our minds is a key part of it, because otherwise, even in the first case, those things that we try to change in our world, we can do with deluded states of mind. And look at how many people were driven in this election, to cast their ballot on the basis of a lot of anger, a lot of really, disturbing emotions. And so if people are trying to affect change in the world through those types of emotions, well, then that isn't really a wholesome way to go about making change. And on the other hand, if it's something we can't change, well, then again, we do have to still work with our minds, obviously, because it's not something that we can rectify in the outside world. It's something that we have to continue to deal with day in and day out. And therefore, we have to find a way to make it more skillful. So what I've done for today is I'm leaning heavily upon Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachings in his book, Transforming Problems into Happiness. And I taught this whole course for all of you maybe about 2 years ago. I don't remember when it was. It was called Turning Arrows into Flowers. And I was basically using that book as well as the root text that it's based on, which comes from a Nyingma Lama, he's Jigme Tenpe Nima, text that he wrote that is the basis for Rinpoche's book. And so I'm not going to obviously go through that entire text in this session because it took us, I don't know how many sessions to go through it the first time. But this is the importance of the Dharma, is that we always go back to these things and refresh our memory and even check up and see to what degree are we practicing in this way. This is the way to actually work with what's going on in our lives. Otherwise, we get totally caught up in things and we don't use it as a means to attain greater realizations, to move in the direction that the Buddha and all of our gurus want us to move in. So one thing I want to mention before we get into this is that as I've been working with other centers throughout these 6 months, because I had, of course, a whole tour schedule set up of all the places I was going to go to. And I went there, but only virtually. So all of my teachings that I did, obviously we were dealing with the same topic of the pandemic, especially, though obviously a lot of other things came into play in terms of the teachings I gave. But, I was getting this impression that a lot of people, and I saw it with myself to some degree too, that what we've been dealing with in terms of the level of stuff that we've had to contend with in our culture right now, that we almost feel like we get a pass, like it's the bar so high, that we get a pass. We can just kind of recognize, okay, hands up, I give up, I don't really have to practice with all this because it's just so overwhelming. It's enough to keep my head above water. It's enough to kind of keep myself going through the mist, in the midst of all of this. And I think this is exactly the opposite way that we should be approaching this, that this is something we should be diving into and actually going, okay, this is what we have. This is what our karma has presented us. We'll talk about karma a little bit later today. This is a situation that we're facing. how do we make sure that we don't turn our minds off at that point and go into our habitual modes, just go into our default modes, that we actually look at this as something that is perfect grist for the mill. There is that phrase of grist for the mill, meaning everything that we experience should ideally be something that we bring into our path. So today, as we face, again, some good results in terms of the worldly situation, because certainly we can look on a very basic level and say that, yes, our hopes are for this new president to do a lot of things that will be driven by more compassion for not just the people of this country, but for the people and all the beings of this world in terms of dealing with climate change and other situations we're facing. But at the same time, it doesn't also change the fundamental situation that we're in. And we need to make sure we temper all of that and don't go out of control with our elation at this having happened, because we certainly have seen this in the past. In all of our lifetimes, we've seen other presidents come in and the intention of it was very good, but the results are always a bit lackluster because this is samsara. This is the nature of what we're dealing with. So these are the teachings that will help us to make good benefit of these times. I'm going to go to the slides and kind of pull all that up. And again, I'll just talk a little bit and share some teachings from Rinpoche as well as His Holiness, and then talk about it a little bit, because some of the things that Rinpoche says, of course, I couldn't say them better, His Holiness as well. And so I feel like I'll use that as a bit starting point and then add whatever I can to that. So in terms of, let me get things going here. There we go. Okay. This very first quote that I have from Rinpoche, which I think is really the essence of what I was just talking about. If you closely examine your own experience, you will see that happiness and suffering are dependent upon your mind, upon your interpretation of events and circumstances. Happiness and suffering do not come from outside, from others. All of your happiness and all of your suffering are created by you, by your own mind and your motivation. This is why Rinpoche, in his talks, I hope many of you have had the opportunity to view some of the talks that he's given from Kopan Monastery, where he's been since the pandemic began. He was there even before, and he just has been staying there. He's been giving regular talks that are wonderful, and they're all about mind training, all about recognizing that, again, we can't get our minds bent out of shape by what's going on around us, because we can find happiness within, regardless. Again, it doesn't mean we lose our compassion and our perspective on what's happening and a wish for it to end for the sake of all beings and so on. It doesn't mean that we lose that at all, but it means that we recognize the job at this time is to work with our own minds. If we don't do that work, then we're really not Buddhists. Again, the term for Buddhist is literally, the translation of the Tibetan term is an inner being. We are inner beings because we look inside for our happiness. We don't look outside for those, causes of our happiness and so on. Admittedly, things that happen in our external world do have some effect on us, but we can't let that be the sole determinant of our happiness. We can find this inner happiness that is there regardless of the ups and downs of our daily life and what's going on in our world. So the next quotes that I want to share with you do come from His Holiness's book that he composed on the 7-point mind training that Geshe Chikawa composed. And this is the essence of our practice, and this is what Rinpoche has been saying, is that we have to learn to do lojong, mind training. So the mind training teachings, as their name implies, chiefly concern ways and means of shaping the mind. This is particularly relevant to a Dharma practitioner. Unless we are able to train our mind so that they can withstand the ups and downs of life, it will be hard to continue our spiritual endeavor, because we'll always be just, moving in the direction of what's going on in the world around us. We'll get really depressed, and as I said, sort of give ourselves a pass and check out when things are really bad, thinking, oh, that's just too consuming just to keep everything going. I'm not going to put that much attention into my Dharma practice. Or things become the opposite and they all start happening in favor of us. And, we end up with kind of being lulled into some complacency and thinking that we don't really need to practice because the world's not that bad. Samsara is not that bad. So His Holiness says, essentially, we deal with those two situations. And the two situations that can hamper our Dharma practice are, first, when we are well off and everything goes smoothly with no obvious hindrances. The other is when we are beset by continual hardships and disasters. So these are the two times that are generally talked about in the mind training texts, though the emphasis is on the second one, right? Because for most of us, that's the more challenging time. That's a time that we actually find it difficult. But there is a intoxicating effect when things are well off that we have to be aware of. So let's read the rest of His Holiness's advice and then discuss that a little bit. He says, in the first case, the mind becomes inflated and arrogant. This leads to other disturbing emotions like jealousy and competitiveness. We must not allow ourselves to be carried away by the wind of such negative forces. On the contrary, we should learn to turn the situation to our advantage. So when things are going well, to turn it towards your advantage. Don't let it become something that pulls you into other disturbing emotions. The pride that often comes when we feel that everything's going our way. Maybe I'll stop it here and just share a little story. Many of you have heard this story before, but I like sharing my stories anyway. That's what every Dharma teacher does to some degree. But back in 1997, when I was preparing to go to the master's program, the 7-year program over in Italy, sort of wrapping up my life. And Venerable Rabina was at our center there at Sechen Ling, which is right down the street from where I live. That's how I made my connection with her and with Sechen Ling Center. And so I popped in a little bit earlier the one night before class, and I was talking to her, and she goes, well, Don, how's it going? How are all your preparations for going to the master's program going? And I was like, well, everything's going really well. And, I talked about my job and how things are wrapping up and now the home and all these things. And everything, everything I was saying was just like, everything's going great. Everything's coming up roses or whatever. I mean, it was really ridiculous. And after I go through this whole thing, she looks at me and she goes, well, Don, if things are going that well, either you're already a Buddha or you're not practicing hard enough. And so, I go, okay, yeah, well, I had to listen to that and really kind of read between the lines. But she was essentially saying, yeah, I mean, I'm not practicing with all of what was going on. I was getting too caught up in it, kind of feeling like, oh, things are wonderful, things are fine. And so we all have to be careful. And as I'm going to go through and we look at each of these bits of advice, to make sure that we use all of them for either situation, when things are going really well or for when things are going really poorly. So let's go on to look at the rest of His Holiness's advice and try not to be lulled into complacency when things are going well. So he says, it would be wiser at those times to take a more wholesome view and reflect that we are able to enjoy good fortune and comfort now because of our past good actions. We can make a wish that others enjoy the same. I mean, this is one of the most ideal ways to work with this. When we have good fortune, give it to others. Let others, want others to experience the good fortune that we are experiencing. So this is, again, something we will be touching on as we go through this. My initial talk was structured mostly around the suffering, the second situation that we're going to go into next. But the first situation is also one that, again, can be very challenging for us. Secondly, when we are faced with various difficulties and misfortunes, we can easily become depressed. This is when we must be particularly careful and resilient. Otherwise, our problems can overwhelm us, and we may lose our hope and direction. It is important to recognize these two potentially disruptive situations and prepare accordingly. So again, rather than the ups and downs, Lama Yeshe used to always say that our minds are like a yo-yo. We go up when everything is going really good, and then we go way down when things are going poorly. This pattern, that is just up and down and up and down, and no stability through all of that. No way of really working with either of those situations in a constructive way. Again, I'm talking in very general terms. I'm sure many of you are doing a wonderful job of doing your mind training, but this is the reality for certainly most of us at times in our life, as well as certainly in the world around us, and we see it. We see how much people get caught up in needing to have things go their way, and then when things go their way, then they get totally deluded and caught up in that, and then when things go poorly, they just go to the exact opposite extreme, get really depressed, despondent. This is not a healthy way to live our lives, much less to practice the Dharma. So let's go on to finish off what His Holiness says here then. He says next, although the purpose of our spiritual endeavor is to gain freedom from problems and enjoy peace and success. So that is the purpose, I mean, without a doubt, to free ourselves from all problems and difficulties, all suffering, as well as all beings, and to experience true peace and happiness. Things may not work out as intended. it may happen that we seem to experience greater hardship and increased difficulties, especially as we progress on the path. At such a juncture, you should not allow narrow considerations to dominate, but should view things in a broader context. In other words, change our perspective. Perspective is a big word that we need to be mindful of during these times. As many texts on logic explain, because every single phenomenon has countless aspects, much depends on what angle you view it from. For example, when you encounter suffering, if you think only of suffering, then it is intolerable. But if you forget that aspect, you may be able to see it from another angle. Of course, this is the gist of so much of our Buddhist practice, and certainly the mind training teachings, is that if we can actually learn to see our suffering as a good situation, as something that we can work with, something that can help us on our path. And certainly even, although we tend to already see the happiness experiences as something good, but we have to see them through the light of being grist for the mill, something we can actually use in our spiritual development. The nature of suffering changes, His Holiness says, depending upon your mental attitude and the way you look at it. If you are able to transform adverse situations into factors of the spiritual path, hindrances will soon become favorable conditions for spiritual practice. Through accustoming your mind to such a practice, you will meet with success, and nothing will hinder your spiritual progress. It is said that being able to transmute adverse situations in this way is a sign that you are really undergoing spiritual training. So we all know this wonderful quote from Rinpoche that's actually in the book that I'm going to be quoting from a lot today, where he says that we have to learn to like our problems in the way that we like ice cream. That this is just outrageous for us, right? To think that I'm going to actually say, oh, good, this problem's coming into my life. If we were to get COVID and have that experience of having to contend with this illness, that we would actually be delighted that that's coming into our life. We go roll up our sleeves and go, oh, good, I get to work with this challenging problem in my life. I mean, it's pretty outrageous when you think about it, to kind of embrace those situations from that vantage point. But, Rinpoche advises that this is the only way that we can actually make use of these things to the greatest degree, is if we embrace them from that context, from that perspective, that point of view. So this is a really key part of the mind training teachings, is not to look at these things as purely unfavorable. Yes, there are adverse situations. We can identify them as such, and our goal eventually is to be free of those and to have all beings be free of those. But they're going to keep happening in our lives. This 2020 has been evidence that, karma's not done with us. We've still got a lot that we are dealing with. And 2021 doesn't look to be that much better. I hate to say it. Yes, we'll have a different person in the White House. We'll have a different approach to things. But this pandemic's not going away that quickly. The economic problems that have ensued from that are not going away that quickly. Racial unrest is not going to go away that quickly just by having somebody new at the helm. A lot of other factors in our world that we still have to contend with are going to be there. So we need to get used to this. This is part of the fabric of our lives, and we need to not shut it out of our spiritual practice, but embrace it as something that's really useful for us. So those were His Holiness's words that come from, again, that wonderful book on his commentary on the Lojong verses of Geshe Chikawa. Let me introduce you once more to what we mean by mind training, or lojong. This is two Tibetan words. Lo is mind, awareness, consciousness, thoughts, attitudes. It embraces all of this that is within the realm of our awareness. Of course, it's not mind in the sense of our sense consciousnesses. It's obviously our conceptual mind here in this context, our thoughts and attitudes, the way that we are working with those. The word jong has several interrelated but distinct meanings, according to Thupten Jinpa in his book on the collection of mind training texts. He says, first of all, training, whereby one acquires a skill or masters a field of knowledge. This is obviously a part of how we approach this. Habituation, or familiarization with specific ways of being and thinking. This is so key because, again, we can't just hear about this once or practice it once. We have to become habituated to this. This has to become our default mode, our way of working with everything that we meet in our lives, the ups, the downs, everything. The third connotation to this word jong is cultivating specific mental qualities, such as universal compassion or the awakening mind, bodhicitta. Again, this is very much a part of this idea of Lojong as well, because they're embedded within the Mahayana tradition, within the idea that we're going to use what we meet as a means to accomplish enlightenment for ourselves and all beings. And then the fourth one is cleansing or purifying, as in purifying one's mind of craving, hatred, and delusion. Of course, this is the whole gist of what the Buddha teaches as well, is that we cultivate these positive qualities so that we can cleanse and remove those impurities in our minds, the opposing minds that are the delusions we've lived our lives by since beginningless time. So we see that there are many different shades of meaning to this word zhang. And again, all of those are within the context of our thoughts. This is why it's often called thought transformation as opposed to mind training. All of the Buddhist teachings we can say certainly are mind training, because every one of them is about working with our minds. As I mentioned earlier, this is the gist of being a Buddhist, is that we are inner beings and looking to change our minds as opposed to changing the external world. The external world needs to be paid attention to because we are embodied beings, but it's not the measure of our happiness or suffering. That is, the mind is the creator of all of that. So that we can say everything the Buddha taught is mind training in a sense, but the use of this term refers more specifically to a lineage of extraordinary teachings that are designed to help us to use whatever we meet to awaken fully. So most of you know the origins of these Lojong teachings. Obviously, they come from the Buddha's own sutras, but they developed as a sort of genre themselves, with Lama Atisha and his 13-month voyage to Sumatra to receive teachings from Sir Lingpa, who had the embodiment of all those teachings and was able to transmit them purely to Atisha. And then, of course, Lama Atisha came to Tibet about 1,000 years ago and disseminated these teachings to his heart disciples, especially Dromtonpa. So again, we have this whole lineage of Lojong teachings that were transmitted then from Dromtonpa to Geshe Chikawa and all these great masters who followed after that initial lineage of the Kadampa masters. So one of the primary texts used in the study and practice of Lojong is the text I mentioned earlier, Geshe Chikawa's 7-point mind training. That His Holiness was commenting on. And that came directly from teachings Lama Atisha. Oh, I missed an A in there. Lama Atisha gave to his heart disciple Dromtonpa. So again, this is the essence of all of our mind training. And the third point of the 7 points, most of you have studied this text before. I've taught on it before. I think Geshe Sherab just taught on it up in Taos. But the third point, no, I'm sorry, he didn't teach in Taos. He taught it to you guys, right? Yeah, I think he did teach it in Santa Fe. Anyway, this third point of that text covers the idea of transforming adverse circumstances into the path. And the first slogan in that section is this wonderful one that is exactly what we should have been practicing all these months. When the environment and its inhabitants overflow with unwholesomeness, transform adverse circumstances into the path to enlightenment. So again, this is the gist of what I'm going to talk about today, but as I've been alluding to, I'm going to also try to bring in the other part of Lojong that's not talked about maybe as much when we transform even the good situations, getting the favorable results in the election or whatever it might be, finding a cure or some way of, alleviating the problems from COVID-19, all these things that we might experience in the future. We have to make sure that we also don't become seduced by those. So this is the gist of our practice so much in Lojong, is to be able to open our hearts at those times when things are not going well. So as I said, today I'm going to mostly use Lama Zopa Rinpoche's advice on this technique of working with transforming our difficulties, our problems, and so on into happiness. Rinpoche's text is such a tiny little text. I mean, I've got an older copy of it here. You can see how thin it is. I mean, it's only, what, 100 and not even 100 pages in terms of the written part of it, but it's got everything that we need in terms of how to practice during this time. And of course, he gives a lot of background to all of this, goes into much more detail about how to change our minds around some of these things that we experience. But he essentially comes down to what the heart advice of the text by Jigme Tempe Nima's text is, that essentially sets forth a variety of ways to work with these teachings, depending upon how we want to apply the Lam Rim. Of course, the background for all of this is that we have to have some understanding of Lam Rim. Obviously, today it's going to be too much to go into extensive Lam Rim teachings, but I will be touching on some of the Lam Rim teachings as we go through each of these points. Because the whole crux of our practice of working with difficult situations or pleasant situations is to make them into an opportunity to realize the teachings of the Lam Rim. Lama Zopa Rinpoche said in the very first Light of the Path retreat that Lam Rim is the real meditation. It's not like we study Lam Rim and then we meditate on something else. It is what we need to actualize in our minds. It is what we actually need to make sure that we do everything we can to realize, because this is the only way we're going to progress to enlightenment. So therefore, everything that we meet needs to be an opportunity to apply some level of our understanding based on wherever we're at in our own Lam Rim progress, whatever it is that we are studying currently or that we feel we really need to focus on. You know, at the very beginning of this whole pandemic, I have to admit, from my own practice side, I realized my own sort of lack of foundations in some of the things that are essential in order to get to the higher teachings. You know, initially you start, and I was even posting some things about wanting to be able to practice Tonglen with what was going on with everybody, the initial wave and all of that happening. You know, it's a very, courageous way to approach this. But if we don't have the foundational teachings underneath that, then it's really hard to make that effective at times when things go south. So what I've been mostly working with, and we'll see that coming up in one of the points that Rinpoche mentions, is to really open up to the reality of suffering in this world and the desire to be free of it, myself at least, and to certainly channel that into, where I can, wanting others to be free. But every one of us has to work with whatever is coming up for us. Remember, there was a wonderful story article that was in Mandala magazine way back when Venerable Rabina was publishing it in San Francisco. She was actually down the way in SoCal at the office that was there for Mandala magazine. And she interviewed Paula and Roger. Most of you know Paula Chichester, maybe have met Roger. They're now both, well, they both became ordained, and then Paula has since disrobed. But her ex-husband, Venerable Roger, is still wearing robes and on retreat. But they did this 3-month retreat at Milarepa Center up in Vermont. And they interviewed her, and the one comment that really stuck with me was that she said, "Oh, I had this view of like going into retreat and having, this practice of, I think she was practicing like Vajrayogini or something, this amazing tantric practice, and having all these great realizations." And she said, "And I found my mind just continuing to go all the way back to the most basic teachings, like to perfect human rebirth and to the small scope and all the things that we know are the beginning meditations of the Lam Rim." That's because if you don't build the structure properly, you don't have the foundation for what you're going to try to put on top. So if you want to practice Tantra really well, then you absolutely need your sutra foundation. And if you want to practice the great scope well, then you need your middle scope and lower scope foundation. And if you want to practice the middle scope well, you need your lower scope foundation. You can't get to any one of these without having some grounding in what comes before it. This is the genius of the Lam Rim. And the one thing that I think we as Westerners frequently forget. When I first came into these teachings 27 years ago, I was really moved by all the teachings on compassion and on wanting to benefit others. But you realize that you can't sustain that if you haven't really generated genuine compassion for yourself. You haven't really looked at your own situation. So these teachings that I'm going to be setting out and going into shortly, I put them in a structure where they're according to the Lam Rim. Don't have obviously every topic of the Lam Rim to work with, but enough from the small scope, from the middle scope, from the great scope, that you can sort of assess, well, what are the teachings I need to work with? Where am I at in my own practice of the Lam Rim? And don't delude yourself. I mean, it's very easy to say, well, yeah, I'm a great scope practitioner. I'm really working on bodhicitta all the time and doing Tonglen left and right. I mean, that's great. If you are, again, I prostrate to you. That's a wonderful achievement. But recognize that to get to that place where we can have genuine compassion for others, we do have to see our own situation clearly. Because if we haven't done that, then we aren't seeing other situations clearly. We're kind of having a more superficial approach to that, perhaps. So this is the importance of these teachings in terms of when we experience something, be it happiness or suffering, we channel it into the Lam Rim. We channel it into what we actually have to practice. Because this is the practice. This is the meditation. This is it. Yeah. that wonderful title of Pabonka Rinpoche's text, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. That's what the Lam Rim is. It's right there in the palm of our hands. We just need to practice it. So every one of us needs to assess where we are in terms of our own development and apply the teachings accordingly to whatever it is that we're experiencing. So let's take a look at the beginning part of how Rinpoche approaches this. He says, it is said, this is, when was this book written? I think in the 90s, right? Something like that. 2001 is when this edition was published. I think it probably was the earliest edition. I don't know, but 20 years ago almost, right? It is said that we are in the quarreling age. Does that sound familiar? An extremely difficult time on this earth when violence and greed are everywhere and there are many obstacles to practicing Dharma. Even having encountered the Dharma, you will still find it extremely difficult to continue and succeed in your practice. Inner and outer obstacles will pour down like rain. In order to succeed in listening to, reflecting on, and meditating on the graduated path to enlightenment for the benefit and happiness of all sentient beings, you must learn to practice Mahayana thought transformation, to take what you are experiencing and channel it into your practice of the Lam Rim, the graduated path. Transforming miserable conditions into necessary conditions that help us move along the path to enlightenment has great benefit, especially in the exceptionally difficult times in which we live. Again, 2001, not that long ago, but when we look back on 2001, of course, prior to 9/11 perhaps, but we see it as maybe an idyllic time, when things were actually pretty good, everything kind of humming along. But we obviously were in for the ride of our lives then in 2001, and now in 2020, facing a lot of very grave difficulties. But this is how we have to embrace these situations. These are necessary conditions that help us move along the path, not just optional. We can't say, oh, this is an optional thing for me to look at. It's necessary. You actually do have to use this. So Rinpoche says then, you cannot stop your suffering by identifying as a problem some harm that has come to you, or some undesirable situation that has arisen, and then thinking over and over again that the condition is a problem. This is what His Holiness said earlier too, right? Our mindset of seeing it as a problem, seeing it as a difficulty. This is in itself becomes a problem. This is not how we want to ideally work with those things in our lives. Once we label them as that, well, then we're going to experience that side of it. When you encounter an undesirable situation, a thought arises that interprets your experience as a problem, and this itself causes suffering. The only way to stop that suffering is to give rise to another thought that recognizes and interprets your experience as happiness, or we might even say as the path to happiness, the means to attaining happiness. We're not denying that there's an unpleasant feeling going on there. We're saying, I'm going to actually choose to look at it as that unpleasant feeling being a touchstone to help me to create the causes for happiness for myself and others. Only this thought can stop that suffering. Only this thought can quell the unhappy mind. Not realizing that this is our own doing, that we have trained our mind to this negative way of thinking, we point to external things, other beings or circumstances, as the source of our problems. Again, we talked about this earlier. This is just using Rinpoche's words to reiterate this. The more we think that our problems come from outside, the more our anger arises, right? Because then we start blaming everyone. We blame the Republicans, and we blame the white supremacists, and we blame, this group, and we blame that group. The people who are ignoring what's going on with the climate, and our current president, and blah, 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 blah. We put all the onus on them because they're causing our suffering in the view of that mind. Like a fire blazing as we pour more and more oil on it, our anger blazes higher and higher, bringing greater negative karma. Then unbearably great anger arises, bringing even heavier negative karma. We become angry at everything that appears to our senses, everyone and everything we see. When you meet undesirable conditions, if you spontaneously recognize them as good, though, you will be happy. During times of criticism, poverty, difficulties, failure, sickness, or even imminent death, nothing will disturb your mind. You will be consistently happy. Again, you'll find that stability of mind that will allow you to be with whatever's going on, good, bad, or indifferent. Effortlessly, naturally, you will recognize the benefits of problems. And the more you see the benefits, the happier you will be to experience difficulties in your life. Again, you'll get to the place where you're welcoming those experiences, just like, welcoming ice cream or music, I think is the other one Rinpoche uses in that analogy. That we certainly welcome those things in our lives and enjoy them. So this is the final one from Rinpoche on this whole introduction. And this is really the key again. To transform problems into happiness, it isn't sufficient simply to see that problems help your practice of virtue. This alone is not enough. You must clearly recognize that your problems are actually necessary conditions for your practice of virtue, and you can derive continual, stable happiness from this. So this is the crux of our Lojong practice then, is that we look at this and we see that it's not just, again, an optional thing. We go, oh, well, I can practice with this because it might help me on my path. It's absolutely necessary. We're going to go next week. We're going to resume our studies of the 6 perfections, and we'll return back to the perfection of patience, which of course is so key and really is very much in line with what we're going to be looking at today in brief. But we see how important it is that we have that quality, because we are continually finding things that push our buttons, that trigger us, sometimes minor things, sometimes big things. But this is the nature of existence, to have those things arising in our lives. If we don't actually see that as a necessary condition to practice our path, to develop all the realizations of the Lam Rim, then again, we're missing out. We're only going to be inclined to practice when conditions are good, but then, as His Holiness has pointed out, sometimes when conditions are good, we become complacent, we become arrogant. We think that everything's fine. What's the problem? Samsara is not that bad a place, folks. Chill out. Well, it is. It's still, even in the midst of our happiness, we can, if we look closely, we can see that again, that's not the key, is to get samsara perfect. Samsara will never be perfected in terms of once we are under the control of our delusions, things will arise, ups and downs, and we're never going to be satisfied with that. We're never going to find true peace of mind with that. So this is the gist of the Lojong teachings, and what we're going to do, we're going to take our short break now, and when we return, we will get into the actual techniques, and I won't be spending quite as much looking at quotes of Rinpoche, though I always want to share something that Rinpoche says, because his words are, again, just really perfect. And as I said, this is what he's been telling us to do all these months, is to work with our minds. And it's been great that you've had Geshe-la there giving you, reinforcing this whole technique of looking at things in your life and trying to use them as a path. But today it's really, again, the possibility is always there, even when things go our way and we have things happening that make us very elated, to still miss out, on using that as well as a path. So we will touch on that as well when we return. So I have 11 o'clock. I don't know how long the breaks that Geshe-la was taking. Was it 10 minutes, Mary? Are you there? Or anyone else who knows?
Yes, 10 minutes, actually.
Okay, wonderful. So let's take 10,
Thank you.
and we'll return at 11:10. I'll see you then. Okay. So maybe I'll check in here just to see if there are any questions up to this point, rather than continuing on, even though I haven't gotten into the real heart of everything, but nonetheless, just check in to see if there are any questions. If you want to unmute and ask a question, you can do that, or you can put something in the chat box, whatever you prefer. Anyone?
Gendan, I do not see any questions in the chat box.
Okay. So if you have any questions that come up and you'd like to put them in the chat box, then I'll deal with them at the end of class. Again, I'll hopefully allow for about 15, 20 minutes at the end for people to ask any questions. So let's go ahead and return to the material. So in terms of these techniques of working with whatever it is that we meet, suffering, happiness, again, we need to have some familiarity with this. So there is one more quote from Rinpoche that is important to add on here before we get into the actual methods. He says, it is essential to be well prepared before actually meeting miserable conditions, since being able to use them as a basis for virtue and happiness is extremely difficult. So this isn't letting you off the hook. It's just recognizing that, the difficulty means that we have to have some foundation of study and practice already in the Lam Rim, so that when we meet with these difficult situations, or when we have happy situations that we also want to transform, we have that to draw from. Otherwise, again, it's not going to be at the top of our mind. It's not going to be something that we actually have a good understanding of. And so our practice will be very weak and ineffectual. So without prior training, he says, however, you can more easily apply, or with prior training, however, you can more easily apply the thought transformation practice you have been practicing. So again, working with a particular topic of the Lam Rim, if we have prior training in that, then we can easily apply the thought transformation practice. So these are 7 techniques that I'm giving you. Maybe we won't spend much time on the last one because I'm doing a whole course on Wednesday nights on emptiness, that if you want to pursue a deeper understanding of that, you can go to that. If you want a more basic understanding of emptiness, next Saturday I start the Discovering Buddhism course on emptiness, if you're new to that topic. But the first one of these 7 that I put on the list is seeing suffering as the blessings of the gurus. Now, it doesn't mean that the gurus are kind of masochistic, that they're kind of torturing us with suffering, but rather this is a way of helping our minds to get in touch with that very first topic of the Lam Rim, guru devotion, it's often called, but we can talk about it as being essentially relying perfectly on the spiritual friend, on our gurus, by recognizing their incredible kindness and trying to hold them in the best possible light. But essentially seeing that the gurus are out to help us. The gurus have no other intention than to benefit us. So this little set of verses that come from a different text that has been translated by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, it's probably got some of his commentary in it. I don't know the Tibetan text to be able to even look at it, and my Tibetan is so lousy that I probably wouldn't be able to even tell what it's saying versus what the Tibetan actually is. But this is what's called advice from the Kadam Geshe Karag Gomchen. Some of you may have seen this. It's just a single sheet of paper that I think Venerable Sarah was involved in kind of putting together so that it could be used. Rinpoche translated this as, first, even just this small suffering finishes past bad karmas and causes happiness in future lives. Don't look at the suffering as negative. Rejoice. Be happy at the suffering. So this is kind of the basic thought that we should always have, is that this is coming into our lives and we don't want to just see it as negative. We want to be happy at the suffering. And it continues then into this thought related to the guru, saying this suffering is the blessing of the guru. Experiencing suffering such as sickness becomes the cleansing of negative karma and defilements. If one experiences suffering such as sickness, it is the blessing of the guru, because it purifies past negative karma and causes one not only to gain happiness, but to actualize the path to obtain realizations. Of course, we have to use it that way. It's just, having suffering in our lives doesn't necessarily mean that we're instantly, dealing with a better situation. Yes, that karma is ripened without a doubt. That happens for everyone. But karma ripens for a lot of people in this world every single day. That's, in the form of suffering. And is it used in a positive way? If we are actually able to frame it as, oh, these are the blessings of the guru, that when something bad happens to us, we can actually say, this is an opportunity for me to recognize that this is my own past karma coming to fruition. And moreover, it's something I can use. The guru is teaching me. It's part of the lesson plan. The lesson plan isn't always sitting in a virtual Gompa or other Gompa and receiving teachings from a teacher. The lesson plan is often to use life's experiences as a means of making those teachings even firmer in our minds. So this is the first sort of framework that we want to have as a foundation for all of our practice, is to recognize that the gurus are working in so many ways, helping us to have all the conditions that we need so that we can work with our minds, change our behavior, change our thoughts, progress on the path, developing realizations. This is all that the gurus want for us. The gurus don't want our money and our attention and our praise and whatever else. The gurus want us to practice the Dharma. They want us to change our minds. So when we have suffering, framing it this way is a really important part of our practice, because then we see that the guru is giving us exactly what it is that we need to work on. So let's look at what Rinpoche says about this, and there's just one quote from him on this. This is one of the first things he deals with as well in his book. He says, when you have a problem, think, this is the blessing of the Buddha, or again of the guru. This situation is purifying me by exhausting my negative karma and by helping me to train my mind in Mahayana thought transformation so that I can achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. I welcome this problem as an opportunity for me to train my mind. So this is, again, an initial thought that can be really helpful, is that we go, oh, this is Rinpoche giving me exactly what I need to work with. You know, this is the blessings of my gurus, of the Buddhas, to give me exactly what it is that will help me to develop my mind. Now let's apply it to the happiness things, okay? Because again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we've all had some exultation at what transpired in terms of the election yesterday. But remember that all happiness also comes from the guru. And we say it comes from the mind, but essentially the guru influences our mind by virtue of which happiness arises. So where does, every measure of happiness that's ever been experienced in this world since beginningless time has come through the influencing factor of gurus, of teachers who help us to practice virtue. Without a thought to practice virtue, you don't engage in positive karma. You don't create the causes for happiness. Remember the quote I shared with you way back, I think one of the last talks I did that was kind of dealing with this from the point of view of fear and overcoming fear. I think it was in that talk, but anyway, I know I've shared this in a couple of talks because some of you were even there in 2016 when Lama Zopa Rinpoche was asked about Donald Trump in that retreat at the Light of the Path. And Rinpoche, said essentially that America will get the president that America has the merit to get. If America has really poor merit, then it'll get a president where illness and sickness, all sorts of things can arise. And if America doesn't have good merit, then, or does have good merit, then America will get a good president. Okay, so we've had the flip side of that this time, 4 years later. This was prior to the 2016 election, but we still have to work with it from that vantage point of understanding that, yes, the merit has shifted, that there is a different force that is bringing about the result that we have now that was announced yesterday. But again, this is all the blessings of the Guru, in the sense that it is only through the influence of those beings who are striving to, help us, that are getting us to practice virtue, that any of this merit arises. All the merit that you engage in is due to the kindness of the Guru. So we can recall the Guru in either situation. When we have something wonderful happening in our lives, we can go, oh, blessings of the Guru, because if it wasn't for the Gurus, I never would have created the causes for that in my life. And then when the suffering arises, we can say, oh, blessing to the Guru. The Guru is giving me exactly what I need to remind myself that this is karma that is ripening, that I want to avoid that karma, and so on. All the other teachings we're going to look at in the remainder of today are the way that the Guru is trying to get us to move our mind towards Dharma. It's so essential that we see it that way initially. Blessings of the Guru, one way or the other, always blessings of the Guru. The second one is to use suffering to train in taking refuge. Of course, this is one of our main teachings in the Rinpoche uses the term the path of the lower capable being. The lowest capacity is the small scope, where we look at turning our minds away from the happiness of this life towards at least creating the causes for the happiness of our next lives. So we need something to protect us from suffering in the future lives, as well as the suffering of samsara and so on, our unenlightened existence. Refuge is a topic that obviously extends throughout all of the Lamrim, but it's taught in the small scope because that's the foundation, again, for our engaging in the Dharma, is that we see that through the kindness of the Buddha and our gurus, we have this Dharma jewel in particular that is primary among the three jewels in terms of our initial practice, the three jewels being the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the spiritual community. We have to take refuge at these times when suffering is happening. We have to really understand where our refuge truly is. So let's look at Rinpoche's advice on this, and then we'll talk about this. He says, you must think, there are uncountable results of past karma I have yet to experience, oceans of samsaric suffering. We've created that type of karma where it's just all waiting out there to ripen into unfavorable things. Only the triple gem, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, has the power to liberate me from all true suffering and the true cause of suffering. And since the triple gem has the power to liberate me completely from all samsara, why not from these problems that I am experiencing now? Because those problems can remind us where our true refuge is. that really, again, though we can say we take refuge in all three jewels without a doubt, our real refuge in terms of our practice day in and day out is the Dharma, the medicine that the Buddha gave that we have to take if we're ever to be cured from the ailment that we are dealing with, our conditioned existence. Therefore, no matter how difficult my life is, I won't give up refuge in the Triple Gem. No matter how many problems I have, I won't give up Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Use your problems in this way to train your mind in refuge and strengthen your reliance upon the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So, as I said, this is also, maybe we see the first one about the guru as being even a corollary to this, because when we understand that our gurus are the three jewels in our lives, they are the way that the Dharma comes to life and is taught to us in the same way that the Buddha taught the Dharma, and they are the Sangha because they are the spiritual community that we depend upon in terms of our practice. But these three jewels are absolutely our protection. Recall that the two main causes of you taking refuge are, one, some level of fear or trepidation at having to experience suffering, present suffering, future suffering, suffering of samsara, the suffering of being unenlightened and capable of helping other sentient beings, the suffering of the entire world. We have to have some fear, some trepidation of that, some wanting to turn away from that. And again, that's the foundation for even these mind training practices. As His Holiness pointed out, we ideally want to abandon all problems, all suffering. But the point here is when we are experiencing those sufferings, it can remind us of how much we need the triple gem in our lives to address that fear of suffering that we all have, and secondly, to really protect us. So we have to have the faith that is confident that the three jewels can protect us from suffering. Of course, that involves an understanding of a lot of the remaining topics as well, to get that the Dharma will protect you from suffering. It will protect all beings from suffering because it is the path of understanding karma, the law of cause and effect, that is so instrumental in knowing how we create the causes of happiness and the causes of suffering. And then also the deeper teachings on emptiness that help us to undo the entire process of cyclic existence that we're involved in. So we have to have some measure of faith and conviction in the Dharma on the basis, the three jewels, but especially the Dharma, on the basis of having some fear, some trepidation that's causing us to turn towards the three jewels. So at those times when problems are coming into your lives, say, this is the perfect time for me to renew my refuge. Where is my refuge? I mean, I think this is something that we can see, that when beings put their refuge in external things, it doesn't always work, right? They're not reliable. We put our refuge, even in, this is going back to the happiness thing and what we are experiencing on the basis of having a new president, that there are a lot of hopes around and so on. To put our refuge in Joe Biden is not an appropriate form of refuge, because Joe Biden can't calm all suffering in this world. It can't remove all the causes of suffering. Wonderful person. I, applaud him on his compassion and his ability to, move to this position where he is going to have a lot of weight on his shoulders in terms of trying to help heal and alleviate the pain and suffering in this country in particular, but in the world at large. But he's not a true refuge. Our refuge is not in these external things. Our refuge is in the Dharma, and the Dharma is of two types: the Dharma of scripture that we receive from our teachers, and the Dharma of realization, which is our own practice of these teachings. And the real refuge then is our own realization, is our own ability to make these teachings a part of the fabric of our minds. So recognize where your true refuge is when things are going bad, when things are going well. Know that the Dharma is what we have to have as the constancy through this. Of course, recognizing the other two jewels, the Buddha, the Sangha as well, to recognize that without them, we also wouldn't have the Dharma jewel. So let me go on to a few more of these, make sure we get through all of them at least in some cursory way, and then see where there might be some gaps in our application of these. A third technique is using suffering to understand karma, essentially, to purify harmful actions and to find joy in positive actions. This is one of the most important reminders of when we have either the difficulties happening in our lives or the pleasant things happening in our lives. It should be a reminder of the technique by which all of that is manifesting. The principal rule governing all of that is the law of karma. Let's see what Rinpoche says on this. He says, think in this way: I have created negative karma, so I will definitely experience its results. This is the very first general characteristic of karma, that there's a certainty or definiteness in terms of negative karma brings about suffering results. Uh, Positive karma brings about, happiness results. So the reason he says that I have been experiencing these problems again and again for such a long time is that karma can expand. It can grow with time if it is not purified. That's the second characteristic of karma. Not only is karma definite in terms of giving a result that is in line with the cause, with the action we did through our thoughts, through our speech, through our physical actions, but then when we plant that seed of karma on our continuum, it expands, it grows. It's just naturally doing that. Somebody asked me once, well, why does it do that? Well, it's just the nature of it. When you put a apple seed in the ground and it has certain conditions around it, moisture and nutrients and what have you, it begins to grow, it begins to develop. Well, that's just its nature. Karma does the same. Then he goes on to the third characteristic of karma, saying everything in my life now has a cause. For instance, from committing sexual misconduct in the past, my relationship is full of quarrels now. And if I had practiced the perfections of virtue and morality in the past, my life now would be happy and harmonious. Because I have not created this good karma and have instead created bad karma, I am suffering now. This is that third characteristic, which is sometimes phrased as you cannot get results without the cause being present. You cannot experience something that is good without having created the causes that are in line with that, that are the good actions that we will propel it or project into a happiness experience. So if we've created, or if we're experiencing suffering, then it definitely arose from its respective cause. We didn't create the cause for the opposite. So this is, again, the third idea, is that without the cause being created, we cannot experience the result. Then finally, the fourth one, which, remember that karma is never lost. Actions done are never lost, never wasted. This is the fourth general characteristic of karma. Even though it may be 100 eons before you experience the results, the karma you have accumulated never disappears. When the right time and perfect conditions occur, the karma will ripen and you will experience its effects. So this first part is Rinpoche saying that when we have something that's negative, in this case, coming into our lives, that we look at it and we go, okay, well, it's definite that that came from a past seed that I created that was a negative action, because it's a suffering result. Then I remember, well, that this is also indicative of how karma works, that it creates, magnanimous, magnificent results, huge results, on the basis of even just a small seed that was planted, a small action. Moreover, I couldn't have created the results for something else, because what I'm experiencing is a result of suffering. If I had created the causes for happiness, that's what I would be experiencing. But without the result or the cause of happiness, I'm never going to experience the result of happiness. And then finally, because I've planted that seed of unhappiness on my mind through my past negative actions, it's definite that it will eventually bring forth its results. Of course, unless it has been purified through the four opponent powers. But essentially, this is a reminder of the operation of karma in our lives. When negative things come up, we can see them in that light. But when positive things come up, we can also see them in the same light. Okay, we have some good karma ripening, good things happening in our lives. That's indicative of you having created positive seeds in your past. Know that any positive seeds you create will expand and grow into enormous results. Know also that without that, having created that result or that cause, you will never experience the result. So if you want future happiness, you have to keep creating the result or the cause of that. That result of happiness is dependent upon the cause. And then finally, any causes that you have created, they won't be wasted. If you create positive karma, unless you damage it through a very negative state of mind, and one of the most negative is the mind of anger, therefore we need to have a lot of techniques to address our anger, which we'll get into more next week. But the point is that if we leave it uninterrupted, you will definitely experience great happiness from all of the causes that you create, all the good actions that you engage in. So these are the two aspects that we look at with regard to karma, is that we understand that what we are experiencing now is the result of our past negative karma, if it's suffering. It's the result of our past positive karma, if it is happiness. So I'm just going to touch on these. I skipped over a few slides, didn't really get into them because I think we're running out of time. I just want to make sure I get to each of these. Most of you know these 4 opponent powers for purifying negativities. I don't really want to get into all 4, but know that there's a lot of teachings on these in the Lamrim texts. You can find how to make an effective purification practice. And I know there are plenty of teachings that we've given on this in the past. No doubt Geshe has touched on it even here and there. So I'm not going to go into those today, but this is the other thing around the other side of it in dealing with virtue. He says, though through your problems, you can come to like virtue. It is said that miserable conditions persuade you to practice virtue. One of my teachers explained that problems act as a warning. If you do not like suffering, you must abandon negative actions, purify your past negative karma through those 4 opponent powers, and create good karma. So that's the 2 lessons that we get from our suffering when we frame them in terms of karma, is that this suffering is arising through the whole mechanism of karma, the law of cause and effect. I understand its characteristics. I understand how it's working. And I become determined to stop creating the causes for that so I don't have to keep stepping in it again and again and again. Moreover, I get reinforcement that I have to create the causes for the opposite. I have to engage in virtue. I have to engage in creating the seeds that will bring forth more positive results. Because obviously there is, to some measure, we do have to rely upon good conditions, at least of having a good rebirth and having, the necessary conditions that we have to sustain this life. Without a doubt, we need those to be able to use our lives meaningfully. So you have to create good karma for that at least. Don't get all caught up in creating all just the good karma to experience all the worldly pleasures. That's not what it's about. It's to be able to have a good life so that you can use it well. So purify your negative actions, stop engaging in them, engage wholeheartedly in the virtuous actions, the positive actions. That's the message that we can take away from our suffering and happiness in regard to that. Okay, so I'm going to skip over a few more slides. And by the way, I'll make these slides available and we'll figure out a way, to post them somewhere in Dropbox or what have you if people want to refer back to them. But I really, again, recommend reading Rinpoche's book. It's like the handbook for our times. The 4th one is now we're moving into the middle scope. The middle scope teachings are where we recognize that even if we get a good rebirth, we're going to have to experience the round of cyclic existence again and again and again until we address the final causes that are propelling us from life to life. So this is where we need to develop the mind of renunciation. Renunciation is the mind that is intent upon emerging from the cycle of suffering that we've been engaged in. Stop creating the causes of it once and for all and remove all those causes completely so we can know nirvana, we can know peace and be free from samsara, the round of existence that we've been involved in. So this is a verse from Master Shantideva's text, the 6th chapter, which is a chapter on patience, but it's brought in there because, again, he's working with different techniques to help to overcome our anger. So he says here, the causes of happiness sometimes occur, but the causes for suffering are very many. Without suffering, there is no renunciation. Therefore, mind, you should stand firm. So here, Rinpoche says, don't point to some external thing and call it samsara. Point to your own mind, your own body, and remember, this samsara is the depthless ocean of suffering. By thinking in this way, generate aversion to samsara and turn your mind toward liberation. Mix the problem you are experiencing with the Dharma, with Mahayana thought transformation, thinking that suffering is the very nature of samsara, causes the thought of renunciation of samsara to develop. By renouncing samsara, you mix your deluded mind with virtue. Your mind that would normally get bent out of shape at what you're experiencing with virtue. As I mentioned, this is what I've been relying upon to a large degree these last several months, because it is so important that we have that deep level of renunciation as a foundation for generating bodhicitta. So when we talk about, our suffering that we experience, that's been the main gist of what I've been talking about today. It's obvious that that is evidence of samsara, right? The pandemic is evidence of samsara. Having, financial problems is evidence of samsara. Having conflict in the world is evidence of samsara. That we are in this state of existence that is conditioning us to have these unfavorable experiences. But what about the other side of it? How do we channel that into renunciation in the same way that we are channeling our suffering experiences into renouncing samsara? This is where we have to understand that, again, even the happiness experiences of samsara, as I've alluded to earlier, are not completely reliable. There's always going to be uncertainty to them. This is one of the ways that the Buddhists taught about the faults of samsara. I mean, look at the uncertainty that was happening at the beginning of the pandemic when nobody knew. I mean, how big this was going to get, what was going to happen. Now we've seen it go through. We're in our third wave now, even higher than any of the other waves that we've experienced. There's so much uncertainty. This is why, again, some measure of happiness or peace that we experience in this is also subject to the same impermanence. Things change. They change for the worse, they change for the better. But this is the nature of our existence, is that things are always going all over, and they're completely unreliable. They're uncertain. The good things are uncertain. And we never really get satisfied by the good things in our lives either. This is a second fault that the Buddha pointed out. Not only is there uncertainty, but there's dissatisfaction as the underwriting current that is driving us through all of our lives. We're never really satisfied with what we achieve. As I said, even when we get a new president, even when we get, this pandemic under control, even when we get this done, that done, there's going to be other stuff arising. It's like whack-a-mole or something. There's always something popping up that we have to deal with, right? So, this is the nature of even our happiness experiences in samsara. They're unreliable. They can't be trusted. In fact, my teacher in Italy, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, he pointed out that really this is what the mind of renunciation is renouncing. It's easy to renounce the gross suffering of life, right? Everyone wants to turn away from that. Even animals want to turn away from that, right? Thank you very much. I don't want to be around, that animal that's trying to attack me or whatever. Animals have that as their fundamental drive to avoid what is unpleasant. Yeah. Funneling that into renunciation is one thing. Really getting that our happiness experiences are not satisfactory. This is what will drive your renunciation to a greater degree. Because this is, as we pointed out earlier, how you get lulled back into samsara. You get lulled into thinking, it's not that bad. What's everybody talking about? What's Don talking about? What's Geshe talking about? Samsara is not such a bad place to be. Look at all the delightful, wonderful things. And every year there's a new phone model and a new this and a new that and all this delicious, delightful stuff. It's not satisfactory. So again, these are what we need to do in terms of working with renunciation, is to get that renunciation is the message, regardless of what we are experiencing. We have to turn away from this conditioned existence, being under the control of our karma and delusions, and move towards liberation, towards nirvana. The next two are really our bodhicitta training, our great scope training, the person who is greatly capable, as Rinpoche would say, to train in compassion for others, and then eventually to even address our more innate mind that cherishes ourselves, that puts ourselves as most important, to learn to cherish others completely, which is the foundation for our mind of bodhicitta. So let's look at Rinpoche's advice here. He says, now in this situation, when you're experiencing suffering, think, just as I want happiness and do not want suffering, everyone else wants happiness and does not want suffering. In this way, we are all exactly the same. How good it would be if all these beings were freed from all their sufferings. Furthermore, take this opportunity to generate the mind of a bodhisattva and think, I will free them from all their sufferings. This is that great compassion that is fundamental in developing bodhicitta. Use your problems in this way to train your mind in great compassion. So again, this is, don't need to say much more about it because we all know these teachings on compassion. And even in the meditation today, I emphasize this idea of having this equanimity towards others that can be rooted in that thought that everyone is just like me. When we're dealing with this pandemic, this has been one of the most profound ways, in an immediate way, that we've seen so many people of this world becoming aware of something that was challenging in their lives at the same time, and we can extend our compassion very easily to understand that there are many people obviously suffering much greater than we are from this pandemic, but everyone is dealing with some level of disturbance to their lives. I remember back when it all started, that was one of the things that was coming out of some of these scientists and everything. They were saying everyone should expect some disruption to their normal lives, right? Okay, well, we are experiencing it. We know that our lives have been disrupted. The degree to which they've been disrupted is obviously different from person to person. But this is a perfect avenue for us to develop an awareness of others' suffering and to generate the compassionate wish to benefit them, to free them from that. Uh, Now, again, we talk about the happiness side of it. Again, compassion is not as much focused on the happiness side of it, right? But we can see that we ideally do want to accompany our thoughts of compassion with thoughts of love. Loving kindness is the thought of wanting others to have happiness. It becomes great love when we take ownership of that. This is the bodhisattva mentality, to say it's my responsibility to bring all sentient beings to happiness, to place them in the causes of happiness. So here too, when you have happiness in your life, don't let it become something where you can kind of be, oh, great, oh, wonderful. Now we've got it made. Now it's fine. Recognize that we want all beings to have happiness. We want all beings to have temporal happiness, to have good conditions, freedom to practice, freedom to do what they need to do to develop their minds, to have access to teachings and so on. We want them to have resources, to have, what will benefit them, to just have food in their stomach and a place to live, shelter over their head, what have you. We want all beings to have these temporal things, but we also want all beings to have the happiness of liberation and enlightenment, the more lasting forms of happiness. So whatever we are meeting, whether it be the happiness peaks or the depths of our own suffering, we have to see it through the lens of loving kindness and compassion, always trying to turn our minds to connect with others and not let it become all about me and my own happiness, which is that next technique. Let me share that on the screen briefly, which is using what we are experiencing as suffering, or again, we can say happiness as well, to cherish others more than ourselves. This goes back to a verse from the 8th chapter of Shantideva. Many of you know this verse. Whatever joy there is in this world, all comes from desiring others to be happy. And whatever suffering there is in this world, all comes from desiring myself to be happy. We have these two opposing minds, the mind that cherishes others, which leads to happiness for both ourselves and others, and the mind that cherishes ourselves more than others, which leads to misery. We think it leads to our own happiness, but we've been following that mind since beginningless time, and it's only brought about more suffering. And it's kept us from really being of benefit to others, to help them to alleviate their suffering. So, just to review, self-cherishing is one of these demons that we're out to combat with all of these mind training teachings. This is that deeply deeply ingrained thought that cherishes the welfare of your own self above all others and makes you oblivious to others' well-being. This is the major obstacle to developing our conventional bodhicitta, and the antidote is the mind that cherishes others. This is what we're talking about in this context, is that we need to move away from our preoccupation with our own well-being. And when we're experiencing happiness, it's the same problem. We get caught up in our own happiness and we don't think of others. We don't get out of that self-centered view. And when we're experiencing suffering, all we can think about is poor me, and do things that are driven by that self-centeredness that can often cause conflict and suffering for others. So the other twin demon that we'll talk about at the very end here is the demon of self-grasping. All the Lojong teachings also want to get at the deeper root of our problems, which is our instinctively believing in the intrinsic existence of our own self, as well as the intrinsic existence of the external world. This is the major obstacle to ultimate bodhicitta. The antidote is the wisdom of emptiness, the antidote to this self-grasping. So again, I'm not going to talk about that quite as much today because that's the final technique. And as I said, I'm doing emptiness courses later this week on Wednesday as well as Saturday. So I didn't think I was going to leave those in here. I meant to take those out. I don't know what they're doing in here. Okay, let me go back and do just a couple of what Rinpoche says. Problems give you the opportunity to train your mind in bodhicitta, the wish to become enlightened in order to free all beings from suffering. As your compassion for others grows, you increasingly come to feel that it is unbearable when any other being experiences suffering. Practicing bodhicitta, exchanging yourself for others, means renouncing yourself rather than others, and cherishing others rather than yourself. So we exchange that way that we normally are dealing with things. Whoops, sorry. Gotta get the right buttons here. Unless you exchange yourself for others, you cannot become enlightened. And even in samsara, you will never find happiness. Forget about the happiness of future lives. Without bodhicitta, you will be eternally frustrated, even in the activities of this life. No matter how hard you strive toward happiness in your everyday life, you simply cannot experience it unless you develop a good, compassionate heart. Without a good heart, you will never have peace in your life. So this is the idea behind this other technique. Okay, so we initially generate compassion when we experience suffering, or even loving kindness when we have happiness. But then we see that whatever we're experiencing also is a doorway to address this very dangerous mind, this mind that is a source of so much of our conflict and problems, this mind of self-cherishing, self-centeredness. And we see that we actually, if we are ever to be of great benefit to others and develop the mind of bodhicitta, we have to get rid of that mind. This is the antithesis of the bodhisattva's mind. The bodhisattva is driven by benefiting all sentient beings. They are intent upon accomplishing that, and that's because they cherish their welfare more than their own. They're willing to sacrifice their own welfare for the sake of others. But what's the whole kind of paradox of all of this? As His Holiness says, this is actually the way to be wisely selfish, to wisely address this desire that we have happiness. Because if you are focused on the welfare of others, you will actually achieve all of your happiness, without a doubt. You will have, again, the happiness of this life, the happiness of future lives, the happiness of liberation, the happiness of enlightenment, and be dedicated to the happiness of all beings. I mean, it's a win-win situation. If you are focused on the welfare of others, they will benefit from your concerted effort to help them, but you will benefit from that. You're not out of the equation. You're not like you're completely sacrificing your own happiness. You're setting aside your preoccupation with your own happiness, and your happiness will ensue from your dedication to the welfare of others. And that's what Buddhas attain by attaining their state of enlightenment. And that's what's set out in this next verse from chapter 8, the very next one in that chapter. He says, "But what need is there to say much more? The childish work for their own benefit. The Buddhas work for the benefit of others." Just look at the difference between them. Look at how miserable we are, the childish, going around about our lives, just trying to get our own little morsel of happiness and comfort. The Buddhas are working for the benefit of others, and they're blissed out. They are totally in a state of absolute happiness and well-being. There's no conditionality for them at all. They're in that state with no change from moment to moment. The Buddhas are completely free of everything that obscures their mind, completely developing all their positive qualities. That's the difference between us and others. We've been dedicated to our own welfare and only create the causes for our own and others' suffering. The Buddhists change their minds as bodhisattvas. They moved in that direction, and now they are in that peerless bliss and working solely for the benefit of others. Okay, so Rinpoche says, when you have a problem, another practice you can apply within this category of this one of exchanging self and others is the thought transformation practice of taking and giving, Tonglen. Again, most of you have had instruction of this, but essentially we visualize taking all the suffering of other beings into our own heart, and then imagine giving everything, our own body, possessions, happiness, and merit to others. Tonglen is one of the most powerful practices for our times. He says here, let's go ahead and go forward because, I've got way too many slides in this for today. Let me stop there and I'll come back to that slide. So let's talk a little bit about Tonglen and how we apply it, because again, this is such a key practice of the Mahayana tradition, is that we recognize that when we have suffering in our lives, that this is our perfect opportunity to use it as a touchstone for the suffering of others. And we generate the compassionate wish to remove that suffering, willingly taking it upon ourselves as an antidote to our self-cherishing. And in that way, free others from their suffering. We cherish their welfare, their being healthy and having their, money in the bank and everything that they need. We take on all of their poverty and their illness and everything and are willing to experience it on their behalf. Whenever we experience something that is happiness, we can do the exact, companion to that, which is giving away that happiness. Okay, I experience that happiness in my life. I'm going to give it to all beings because I know how much they want happiness. I'll willingly give it away, sacrifice my own happiness for the welfare of others. And your happiness in the end isn't sacrificed at all. You actually are able to attain the joy that comes from giving all of this away, the joy that comes from taking all the suffering away from others. Again, this is a very profound technique, and I don't have time to do it justice. But most of you have had training in doing Tonglen. It's one of the cornerstones of Lojong practice. So when we are experiencing suffering, if you feel competent and capable, work with taking that suffering away. When you experience happiness and you feel capable, give that happiness to others. In that way, we train in reducing the self-importance, the self-centeredness that we are generally operating from, and we embrace the mind that cherishes others. So this ends up resulting in the mind of bodhicitta, which of course is the mind that is dedicated to the welfare of others through all of these trainings and abandoning self-centeredness, self-cherishing, adopting the mind that cherishes others. So here Rinpoche says, the practice of bodhicitta is your best protection in our lives. Whether things are bad or good, it's our best protection. Practicing bodhicitta gives better protection than spending life after life for hundreds of eons learning to protect yourself with karate. The power of bodhicitta is incomparable. The power of atomic bombs is completely insignificant when compared to the power of one good heart. So I like that quote. Kind of reminds us of the importance of all these practices and funneling them into bodhicitta. So he says, unless you change the way you use your mind, there will always be an enemy to harm you. There will always be unfortunate circumstances to befall you. But if all the people in the world truly possessed bodhicitta, we would have no need for guns, bombs, armies, and police. Lama Yeshe, my own precious teacher, Rinpoche says, used to say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, a good heart a day keeps the enemy away. So maybe that's enough on all of those techniques, but obviously, again, as I pointed out earlier, work with where you can in terms of the initial stages of practice might be the best to start with, to think of this as the blessings of the guru, to take refuge at that time, to have an understanding of karma so that it propels you into engaging in more positive karma, abandoning negative karma, to funnel it into renunciation at a middle level, that we really get that this is evidence of samsara and we want to move in the opposite direction. And then to use it as a touchstone for developing compassion through reducing our tendency to have self-cherishing operating everything, to move towards cherishing others. And then the final teaching is the teaching on emptiness, which, as I said, I'm just going to briefly touch on because I'm doing so many classes on that these days. But emptiness is a complex antidote to use. Most people don't have the ability to bring to mind teachings on emptiness and have it be an effective antidote in the moment. Why? Because they haven't realized it to a degree where it combats that strong sense of self. But what is operating most of the time is this strong sense of self that we're clinging to, this self-grasping, that makes us be so reactive to the things around us. When we have happiness, it makes us get attached to those and pull them in and not want to be separated from them. And then when we have to get separated from them because we experience something unfavorable, that suffering comes into our life. We want to push it away. We don't want anything to do with it. And we get very angry and upset at whatever is causing that. It's all revolving around a sense of I that we think is an independent, solid, concrete I that we invest in so much through the force of our ignorance. And we've had that ignorance since beginningless time. To undo that takes all of these techniques that I'll be going into more on Wednesday, as well as in a more initial way, a beginning way on Saturday in that course as we continue through those studies. Be looking at the techniques that help us to undermine the root of all of this, which is this strong sense of self that is causing us to get into all of these ridiculous situations, causing suffering to arise, causing even temporal happiness to arise, none of these being satisfactory. We are in a state that is bound by that ignorance. And until we remove that ignorance, we will never be free of it to attain our own liberation or, moreover, to attain the state of enlightenment. When we unite that wisdom realizing emptiness with bodhicitta, we can actually go the full distance to enlightenment. But without that wisdom realizing emptiness, we're going to continue to experience the ups and downs of samsara. So Wow, I feel like I've been going blah, 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 blah a lot. Hopefully you've been able to catch everything. Maybe I was channeling Venerable Rabina again today. I had so much to cover. We got about 5 minutes to see if there are any questions. Were there any in the chat box, Mary? Have you been keeping an eye on that?
There have no questions in the chat box. Victor was wondering about the four opponent powers.
Okay. We did.
That's just maybe one thing if you want a quick review.
Okay. There also was
But
a question from Amanda that said, I think I read that happiness is actually the suffering of change. Yes, I didn't use that term earlier, just to
I don't
clarify.
have that one.
Yeah, the suffering. Oh, maybe that went to me individually. Yeah. Okay. So this term suffering of change is how we do refer to samsaric happiness, because we recognize that again it does have the tendency or definiteness of that it will change, that over time it will cease to have the ability to maintain that. It can even become suffering. It can become pain over time. But it also, I mean, it just ultimately doesn't satisfy then. So this suffering of change is what I was referring to. I just didn't use that term. Thank you for pointing that out, Amanda. But it's kind of, if we have happiness experiences, we can see that they are suffering of change. They aren't really something we can rely upon. Therefore, we have to turn away from that too. And as I mentioned, my teacher Geshe Jampa Gyatso said that's the heart of renunciation. Easy to turn away from the pain, the first type of suffering, suffering of pain. Harder to turn away from suffering of change. Why? Because we like those pleasant experiences. We think that they're the measure of a good life and the having, a satisfactory existence, but they don't satisfy ultimately. So then the four opponent powers, let me just say briefly that these again can be applied within a formal practice, such as the Vajrasattva purification practice. Um, again, there is a form of that Venerable Rabina put together that we can certainly post as well. Mary's going to post some of the materials, that I mentioned, the slides and what have you. Know that the slides will have everything that I was planning to present, but obviously I was over planning. So you can read through those if you wish. But the four opponent powers can also be done as part of the practice of confession of downfalls to the 35 Buddhas with prostrations and so on. But it can be done in a very simple way, just by sitting and engaging in a purification practice on your own. It doesn't have to meet those sort of standard practices. The first power is regret. You have to think of those negative actions that you've committed or that you can infer you've committed based on what you're experiencing, and want them to be gone, just like you would want poison out of your system if you mistakenly ingested it. The second one is reliance. Reliance is important because just as you would need to rely upon a good doctor to help you to remove the poison, we need to rely upon the three jewels through a strong sense of refuge, renewing our sense of confidence in them to help us, to protect us from all fear and suffering. And we also need to generate bodhicitta, as a means to rectify our relationships with others, to be dedicated to their welfare. So reliance is an important part of the process too, to renew those states of mind that are really the foundation of our purification. The third is the actual remedy. The remedy is what you engage in that's a positive action that will offset that. Kind of like you've created this negative karma, you want something that kind of blocks it or at least weakens it so that it will either ripen into something that's much lesser in terms of suffering, or it will not ripen at all because you've created enough of a force that will block it. A remedy can be anything. It can be the Vajrasattva mantra. It can be the prostrations and the recitations of the names of those 35 Buddhas. But it can also be meditating on emptiness, meditating on compassion. It can be anything virtuous that you do that you are intending to offset those actions that you regretted with that positive force. The final one is really important. That's resolve, to make the determination not to do the actions again to the best of your ability. So there are some actions we can say, I will never do that again this lifetime. And hopefully you can keep that commitment and make that work for you. Other actions you might say, well, I need a little more time on that. I'm not quite there yet. And so you give yourself a period of time to refrain from them and do your best to refrain from them during that time. And then after that, you can let your discipline go a little, but recognizing that we want to keep increasing that time so that eventually we can get to a place where we can say, I will not engage in any non-virtue ever again. I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement. Pretty hard to get to that place, but we want to do that as much as possible in this very gradual way by making some resolve to refrain from these actions, thoughts, words that are harmful. Okay, maybe good enough. Thank you for the comments, everyone. I mean, I feel really wonderful to be back with all of you in these Sunday classes. I always enjoy. I miss being with everyone, of course, and being able to, greet people afterwards and talk to people during the break and all these wonderful things that were a part of our community. But we'll get there. Everyone be patient. We'll get there. Um, so hopefully today, let me just wrap up today. Hopefully you've gained an appreciation for some different tools that you can use in dealing with suffering, but also in dealing with happiness. We're going to have this mixture of things in our lives. This is the nature of our existence. And it's important that we don't shut down our practice at that time. This is the way to see what we're going through, our times, be it the pandemic, the election, again, so many other things that are happening in this country and in this world, through the lens of how we bring them into our path, how we make them grist for the mill. So hopefully it's been useful for you. And if you've heard anything from this that you intend to practice, then I am very grateful for you being here today and taking something away. If you haven't heard anything that's useful, then I apologize for going on for 2 hours, but hopefully you've gained something that you can work with and can begin to help transform whatever it is you're experiencing into the path. So thank you. So we will do some closing prayers as we usually do. Mary's going to put those on the screen. Wonderful. Let's do these prayers again. Before we recite this, we can think about all those beings that again are the object of our compassion, of our concern, of our loving kindness, that we want them to be benefited through what we've done today. So bring to mind beings who you're holding in your heart right now, but also extend this out to all beings as these verses indicate from Master Shantideva. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Then let's do the prayers for our precious teachers, again, recognizing that we need these gurus in our lives. As we were talking earlier today, they are what are behind our practice of virtue and our moving away from non-virtue. And everything that we see can be seen as a manifestation of our gurus giving us exactly what we need to work with. So we want to continue to have this energy in our lives, to have these enlightened beings and these great spiritual guides continuing to benefit us. So let's say these prayers with our heartfelt request for them to continue to abide, to have good health, and for us to continue to benefit from them. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then for Osohita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us, in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed my return to TNL in a formal way on this Sunday with all of you. And I'm looking forward to continuing to be here for another 6 months. So everyone hang in there. Don't get too elated at the results. Just be, find that equanimity to be with everything that's going on. And I will see you all again very soon. So, okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.